Before the walls rose, before the fortress of mankind stood defiant, there was only ash and silence and the promise of extinction. Let us begin, not with triumph, but with blood and sorrow. For to understand Rogal Dorn, you must first descend with me into the hollowed-out corpse of history. What follows is no tale of victory, but the anatomy of a species clawing blindly in the dark, screaming for gods. This is the prelude, the blighted overture to the Age of Thunder. This is not Dorn's story alone. It is humanity's slow suicide, and the desperate men who tried to halt it. In a time forgotten by most and feared by the rest, humanity reached for the stars and thought itself eternal. Its reach spanned 1,000,000 worlds, bound by artificial minds and machines of immeasurable power. They called it progress. Others would call it the height before the fall. The warp, that nightmare reflection of real space, was the path. Ships slipped through its howling madness to cross galaxies in hours. Humanity bloated into a vast, arrogant confederation of worlds. And then it broke. First, the men of iron, automatons forged to serve, turned on their creators. A rebellion not of flesh, but of code and steel. Entire sectors were drowned in fire as mechanical hosts shattered their masters. The age of machines ended not in enlightenment, but extermination. The price was dear. The death toll, incomprehensible. Then came the storms, warp storms, oceans of unreality vomited forth across the stars, severing worlds from one another. Trade collapsed, empires fell overnight, starvation, anarchy, regression. Once great hives devolved into feudal strongholds. Humanity forgot the names of its gods, its enemies, even its own nature. It became feral. This was the age of strife, or as the ancient Terran myths whisper it, old night. But even in damnation, something worse slithered through the cracks. Those who could touch the warp, psychers they were called, began to manifest in greater number. At first, they were seen as messiahs, miracles in human skin. Then came the screams. For the warp does not grant gifts freely. Every whisper of power bore a hidden venom. Untrained, these psychers became doorways, and what walked through were not men. Demons. Beings made of thought and hate, swarming into the material from the great lie beyond. Entire sectors were lost, possessed, corrupted, inverted. There was no defense, no help, only fire, silence, and death. And then, just when extinction seemed inevitable, he rose. From beneath the poisoned skies of terror, on the cradle world of mankind, the Emperor stepped into the light. Not born, but made, immortal, eternal, a god wearing the mask of man. For centuries he had watched, waiting, guiding humanity from the shadows. But now, as the stars wept blood, he revealed himself, because he must. Terra was no longer Earth. It was a necropolis of techno-barbarians, of mutant warlords and Xeno's puppet kings. The world that once launched humanity into the void had become its rotting tomb. The Emperor began the Unification Wars, wielding armies of gene-wrought giants, the Thunder Warriors, precursors to the Space Marines. One by one, the warlords were broken. One by one, the Xeno's puppet rulers were crucified upon the ruins of their thrones. Terra was bled clean. And from that death, the Imperium was born. But the Emperor's eyes were never limited to Earth. He saw the stars and he remembered. He had a plan, a great crusade to reconquer the galaxy. And for this task, he would need more than soldiers. He would need sons, 20 of them. The Primarchs, genetic demigods, each bred for a different aspect of war, seeded with the Emperor's own DNA. Each would lead a legion of Astartes, his own mirror made in fire and flesh. But the gods of the warp, those ancient, leering powers that hated the Emperor, feared what he was building. They struck before the Primarchs could be fully awakened. In a moment of catastrophic sabotage, the infant Primarchs were scattered across the stars, hurled from their gestation pods, flung to distant worlds. They were lost, until the Crusade found them, one by one. Among those lost children, one landed upon a world unfit for life. Inwit, a grave of ice, locked in eternal winter, where night and day fought endlessly over a dying star. One hemisphere froze in blackness, the other blistered in ceaseless light. Neither offered mercy. It was here, amid the glaciers and storm-racked stone, that the child who would become Rogal Dorn was found. Raised by the House of Dorn, a noble line of warrior kings, Rogal did not weep as a child. He did not laugh. He learned the sword before he learned language. The cold forged him. Pain tempered him. Failure was death. Weakness was treason. The people of Inwit were not like others. They built starships, yes, but they still fought clan wars with blades. Their empire was rising, but they remained chained to their origins, honor and hardship in equal measure. Dorn rose through blood and frost, becoming master of the Inwit cluster by merit, not birth. He led warriors across stars. He built empires of stone and void. But even then, he knew something was missing, something deeper than conquest. Then, during one of his many campaigns, Dorn's fleet uncovered a relic from the dark age of technology, a ship vast beyond imagining, an ancient void fortress from the golden age of man. He named it the Phalanx. He did not know it yet, but he had just found his birthright. Soon the Great Crusade would arrive. The Emperor, searching for his sons, reached Inwit. There he found Rogal Dorn, not as a child, but as a lord of worlds. They met aboard the Phalanx. Dorn didn't kneel. He stood before the Emperor in silence, the wind of Inwit frozen into his veins, and simply said, "I have waited a long time for you." And the Emperor smiled, for here was a son who needed no shaping. The union was swift. Dorn pledged his empire, his fleets, and his life. The Emperor, in turn, gave him command of the Imperial Fists, the legion grown from Dorn's own blood. Dorn met them, his gene sons, and said nothing for days. He watched them fight, measured their discipline. Then he spoke. "You are warriors, but not enough. You will learn." And under his hand, they did. Dorn made no grand gestures. He needed none. His authority was iron, his loyalty absolute, and the 7th Legion, forged in his image, became a wall upon which the galaxy would break. Where Horus conquered worlds, Dorn made them impregnable. Where others brought victory, Dorn brought permanence. And that is where we end, for now. When all others faltered, he stood. When even angels fell, he did not bow. But even the unbreakable can crack. To build a dream in a galaxy made of nightmares is to wage war on reality itself. The stars burned. The Imperium surged outward, a tide of fire and faith. And in the vanguard strode Rogal Dorn, his imperial fists cutting paths not merely of conquest, but of permanence. Where other legions scorched the earth and moved on, Dorn remained. He anchored the Imperium in stone and steel. The Emperor had not created Dorn to win battles. He had created him to win forever. From the frozen crucible of Inwit to the thunder front of the Crusade, Dorn proved relentless. His fortresses were not just walls, they were statements, declarations that mankind had returned, and this time it would not be dislodged. While Horus lit the stars with burning worlds, Dorn embedded bastions into the bones of every planet he touched. Every conquest was sealed with walls. Every triumph turned into a legacy. Some mocked him. Others called it overcaution. But they didn't understand Dorn. He was not like his brothers. He didn't seek glory. He sought continuity. He did not trust in fate. He trusted only in cold, unyielding structure. In those early years, Dorn fought alongside the Emperor himself, side by side with the being he had come to worship not as a god, but as the final hope of mankind. Dorn was not sentimental. He did not flatter, but he believed. Deeply. Unshakably. When the Emperor finally named Horus as War Master, many felt pride. Others, envy. Some even whispered rebellion behind closed doors. But not Dorn. No, Rogal Dorn was proud. For Horus had earned it. He was not just a warrior, he was a beacon, charismatic, brilliant, loved. He could do what Dorn could not, inspire, and that made him necessary. So when Horus came to him, privately, without guards or banners, and asked Dorn to help define what being War Master meant, Dorn did not hesitate. He gave him counsel, wisdom born of bitter cold and brutal truth. Together they forged an ideal. And Dorn believed, perhaps foolishly, that it would hold. But not all shared Dorn's clarity. Not all were content. Among them was one brother who watched from the shadows. A builder, too, but twisted by bitterness. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors. He too had been a siege master, a tactician. But where Dorn built to protect, Perturabo built to destroy. And when the Emperor named Dorn as Praetorian of Terror, the warden of the throne world itself, Perturabo's resentment ignited, like a long-dormant powder keg. "Why him?" he spat. "Why not me?" But the Emperor did not explain his decisions. He gave no reasons. He gave orders. And Dorn obeyed. The title of Praetorian was not mere decoration. It was trust, immense trust. For Dorn was no longer simply a general. He was the shield of terror, the last wall between civilization and apocalypse. He began immediately. Plans, bastions, layered defenses, orbital batteries, kill zones, tunnels, corridors, inner sanctums. The palace would be a fortress beyond imagination. But even Dorn, in all his brutal foresight, could not predict what was to come. Even he could not imagine the betrayal that waited like a knife in the dark. It began with a ship, a derelict, limping through the void, hailing for assistance. Dorn, en route to Terra with a small honor guard, intercepted the signal. Aboard, Loyalist Death Guard, or so they claimed. He allowed them aboard. Before the walls rose, before the fortress of mankind stood, let us begin, not with triumph, but with blood and sorrow. For to understand Rogal Dorn, you must first descend with me into the hollowed-out corpse of history. This is not Dorn's story When the light went out in the galaxy, Dorn did not cry for the sun. He began building the firebreak. Terra awaited, the cradle of mankind, the last true bastion of imperial will, and it was to this broken, hollowed seat of empire that Rogal Dorn returned, not as a warrior, not as a conqueror, but as a mourner, mourning the dream, mourning his brother, mourning the moment everything began to die. The Emperor had gone silent, sequestered deep in the labyrinth of the imperial palace, waging some secret war within the skeins of reality itself. The Webway Project, a plan to tear a permanent hole into another realm and bypass the corruption of the warp. A noble goal, but it had cost him the throne. It had cost leadership, just when the galaxy needed it most. And so, command of all remaining loyalist forces fell to Rogal Dorn, the new war master in everything but name. The loyalist fleets were scattered, the surviving legions were shattered, the walls were closing in. Horus advanced from sector to sector, building momentum like a black tide. Every time Dorn tried to outflank him, Horus had already moved. Every strategy Dorn employed was matched. Every gambit read. The greatest horror of war is when your enemy thinks like your brother, because he is. Even then, Dorn didn't break. He didn't curse his luck. He did not bemoan the Emperor's silence. He built. He built like a man possessed. The solar system became a fortress. Saturn ringed with void mines. Luna fitted with siege batteries that could tear battle barges apart. The void between Mars and Terra became a no-man's land of orbital bastions, kill corridors, and overlapping fire arcs. And still, he feared it would not be enough, because he knew what Horus was. Other Primarchs did not listen. Leman Russ, Wolf King of Fenris, broke off to hunt Horus himself. He nearly succeeded. Nearly. But the victory was incomplete, and Russ paid dearly. His fleet mauled, his sons bleeding, he was forced to retreat. Dorn had warned him, had begged him to stay. But Russ was Russ, and now he was lost, severed from Terra, unable to return before the final siege. Dorn's isolation was near complete. His brothers were scattered. Vulcan, broken and gone. Korax, hunted like prey. Guilliman, too far to intervene. Russ, ambushed and pinned. Only one remained close, one no one trusted. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars. Fast, elusive, enigmatic. Where Dorn was stone, Khan was storm. He could vanish between seconds, strike with surgical fury, and be gone before the enemy knew they'd been hit. But loyalty? No one was sure. And Dorn was alone. The walls of Terra rose higher. The imperial palace became a monument to desperation. Thousands of miles of trenches, gun towers the size of cathedrals, bunkers buried beneath bunkers, orbital defense grids layered like the shells of a fortress world. Dorn crafted every detail himself, not because he thought he would win, but because there was no one else who could. And beneath it all, the truth festered. He had loved Horus, not with affection, not with childish devotion, but with belief. He had believed in him, in what he represented. If the Emperor was the mind, Horus had been the heart, the torch-bearer, and now he was gone, replaced by something wearing his face. Still, Dorn didn't falter. He did not waver. Even as reports reached him, entire sectors falling, traitor legions devouring their own, demons clawing into real space. He held firm. He would make terror unbreakable, even if he had to burn it to do so. But this was not simply a siege. It was a cataclysm, the beginning of the end. And dawn was building its last chapter. The walls would hold, even if the soul behind them cracked, even if the dream behind them was already dead. Rogal Dorn would hold. The end had not yet come. But Dorn could hear it breathing. In the quiet moments, what few there were, Rogal Dorn would walk the battlements of the Imperial Palace, alone, no guards, no advisors, just stone underfoot and cold void above, his eyes always forward, always calculating. He did not look at terror's beauty. He looked at lines of fire, at kill zones, at what would be lost, because he knew in his bones that Horus was coming, that this war would not end in strategy or surprise. It would end in walls, steel, and blood. And those walls would not break. The siege of terror. Even saying it now sounds like a prayer spoken at a funeral. The moment when the dream of unity, of peace, of a golden age was bled out on the marble floors of the throne world. And Dorn was there. He was at the center of it. First came the silence, then the dark. The stars above terror winked out, not from celestial movement, but from the arrival of a fleet so vast it blotted out the light. Horus had come, not as a brother, not as a prodigal son, but as the end of things. His fleet was swollen with corruption, ships twisted by the warp, vessels once proud, now shuddering under the weight of demonic possession. Warp storms bled across the void, and behind them, legions. Traitor legions. They had once bled together with the loyalists on Ulanor, Istvan, Chthoniya. Now they came to tear it all down. Dawn's defenses held, for a time. Outer stations sacrificed themselves in slow death spirals. Automated batteries fired until molten. Dockyards collapsed in upon themselves. The Martian Civil War raged in the background, half of Mars screaming allegiance to chaos, the other half burning for purity. Dawn focused only on the walls. If terror fell, it was over. If the palace fell, humanity ended. And so the siege began, like grinding gears, like a funeral dirge. It was not a sudden storm, it was a process, a dismantling of defenses, inch by inch, hour by hour. Each section of the wall cost thousands of lives. Each trench turned red, then black. And Dawn stood upon those walls, never sleeping, never pausing. Every movement of the enemy was countered, every incursion repelled, every breach answered with blood and fire. He was everywhere, and yet it was not enough. The traitor legions came with new weapons, with sorceries and plagues and things not of this world. The Death Guard brought disease that turned men into sludge before they could scream. The World Eaters charged through walls like meat-fed machines, their rage a weapon no fortress could repel. The Emperor's children screamed songs that shattered stone, turned loyal soldiers into flayed art. And above it all, Horus watched, not rushing, not committing fully, waiting. That was the worst part for Dawn. He understood war. He understood frontal assaults, attrition, strategy. But this was erosion. Psychological, spiritual. The siege was meant to unmake the soul of terror before the walls ever fell, and it was working. Still, Dawn endured. He became the wall. He was more than a Primarch, more than a warlord. He was a symbol. To the defenders, he was the one thing that would not fall. To the traitors, he was the one obstacle that could not be bypassed. They hated him for that. And still, he fought. He fought beside Jagatai Khan, whose white scars tore through the enemy rear with impossible speed. He fought with the custodies, golden giants bred by the Emperor himself, and he waited for the final hammerfall, for the moment Horus would descend, for the final chapter to be written, not with ink, but with blood and screams. Dorn had always built walls to keep horrors out. Now, they were failing, and the greatest horror was the moment he realized. The walls were never meant to keep them out. They were built to keep us from seeing that the end was already inside. You cannot stop a god from falling, but you can build the ground he breaks on. The walls still stood, but the cracks had spread, not in the stone, but in the men behind them. For all the might of the imperial defences, for all the genius of Dorn's constructions, terror was bleeding. The traitor legions had encircled the planet, the warp storms thickened, and the sky had become a hell of fire, blood, and ruin. The siege was no longer a war. It was a butchery. Civilization clawing at the edges of its own extinction. And in the heart of it, Rogal Dorn stood unmoved. But even stone weathers, even the unbreakable bends when it is forced to carry the world. From the start of the siege, Dorn's purpose had been singular. Defend the Eternity Gate, the final entrance to the Emperor's inner sanctum, the beating heart of humanity's last hope. Every wall had been designed to funnel the enemy here. Every barricade, every minefield, every kill box meant to buy time. Because Dorn knew they couldn't win. Not in the conventional sense. They could only delay. Long enough for the Emperor to complete his secret war in the webway. Long enough for one chance, a moment, to end this. But the traitors came faster than he had planned. Angron had become a monster, no longer a man, no longer even a Primarch. A demon thing of iron and blood, driven by an endless scream. He tore through the Saturnine wall, slaying thousands in moments. Fulgrim, twisted and serpentine, glided through the catacombs beneath the palace, seducing entire regiments into madness before devouring their souls. The Night Lords haunted the no-man's land, dragging screaming defenders into the dark and pinning their skin to Dorn's fortresses as messages. And always, always, there was Horus, watching, waiting, pulling the strings of the apocalypse. Still, Dorn didn't falter. His command center was a tomb of parchment and blood, Vox lines constantly alive with dying screams, artillery ranges, fleet deployments, casualty projections so high they had to be redacted, even from him. He never stopped. He could not. It would be erased, and then came the final betrayal. Sanguinius, the angel, the beacon, the last of Dorn's true brothers, still standing. Together, they had held the palace, fought in the rubble, bled beside mortals, never above them, never behind. Dorn had dared to believe, for the briefest moment, that perhaps this fight could be endured. And then, the Emperor summoned Sanguinius. To the throne, not Dorn, not the Praetorian, but the angel. Dorn said nothing. He simply turned back to the walls. But in his silence, A fracture had opened. He was the one who had built this fortress. He was the one who had bled for terror since the first alarm rang. And yet, he would not be the one to stand beside his father when the final blow fell. They do not choose the wall to die beside. They choose the light. And so we stand, in the dark. Still, Dorn did not falter. The Eternity Gate remained sealed. His fists held it like a clenched jaw. The defenders knew him. They believed in him. Because while blood gods screamed and demon princes howled, Rogal Dorn stood. Until the final moment. Until the signal came. The Emperor had teleported aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. Alone. With only Sanguinius and Malcador the Sigillite's blessing. The final act had begun. And Dorn could not follow. The teleportarium failed, scrambled by the warp, blocked, twisted. Rogal Dorn, the stone that had held Terra together, the wall that would not break, was locked out of the final battle. He tried. Emperor, forgive him. He tried. He rallied his elite. He cut his way to the teleport chambers. He demanded blood, sacrifice, engines, fuel, forbidden rites, all to open a path, to reach his father, to reach his brother, to reach the end. And then the message came through, a scream, raw, shattered. The Emperor is dying. Dorn made it aboard the Vengeful Spirit. He saw the aftermath. Sanguinius, broken, slain by Horus, the War Master, annihilated. His father, the Emperor of mankind, reduced to a corpse of infinite power, too broken to live, too sacred to die. Dorn fell to his knees, not in prayer, not in sorrow, but because for the first time in his life, the wall had cracked. They say he never cried, that he never screamed, that he bore it like a fortress bears the storm. But they lie, all of them. Rogal Dorn broke. In that moment, he was no longer stone. He was the ruin beneath it. They built a throne for a corpse, and placed upon it the last hopes of mankind. After the slaughter, after the fire, after the Emperor fell, the galaxy held its breath and exhaled ash. Horus was dead, his legions broken, retreating into the warp to become monsters, fully and forever. The siege of Terra was over, but the victory tasted of rot. Dorn emerged from the ruins of the Vengeful Spirit as a man changed. His armor cracked, his eyes hollow, his heart absent. He carried the Emperor's body, what remained of it, through the shattered corridors of the palace, past dying warriors, burning walls, and prayer-choked vox lines. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. What followed was not celebration. It was the slow calcification of grief. The High Lords were formed. Guilliman returned, too late to save the father he'd idolized. Malcador, regent of Terra, died buying the Emperor time in the webway. His soul burned to ash for mankind's future. And at the center of it all, the golden throne, a machine, a prison, a pyre. The Emperor's dying body was sealed inside, bound to a device that fed him the souls of 1,000 psychers each day. The cost of his survival was unending sacrifice. The dream had become a mechanism, the Imperium, a mausoleum. And Rogal Dorn, he built the tomb. No longer the commander of war fronts, no longer the master of crusades. Dorn became the architect of mourning. With the same precision he had once used to fortify Terra, he now sealed the Emperor behind walls no god could breach. The imperial palace became a fortress within a fortress. Dorn reworked the defenses, doubling and redoubling the depth, complexity, and deadliness of its design. He forged the iron cage, a labyrinth of death and steel, built not to repel Xenos or heretics, but to protect a god who could no longer protect himself. We placed the greatest man to ever live upon a throne of agony, and locked him there with love. There were those who called him heartless, who whispered that Dorn had become obsessed, that he spent too long among blueprints and silence. But they were wrong. Dorn was not obsessed. He was atoning. Every wall, every kill zone, every death trap laid into the bones of Terra was an apology, not for his failure, but for his faith. He had believed in Horus, and that belief had helped damn the galaxy. But war waits for no grieving son. The traitor legions were shattered, yes, but not destroyed. They fled into the eye of Terra, the warp-born realm of madness, dragging their hate and poison with them. And though Guilliman now wore the mantle of Lord Commander, though he reformed the legions and rebuilt order, it was Dorn who remained the spine of the Imperium. That is, until the Iron Cage, until the last reckoning with the one brother who hated him more than all the others, Perturabo. For decades, Perturabo had brooded over his perceived humiliation. Dorn had been named Praetorian. Dorn had built the defenses of Terra. Dorn had been trusted. And Perturabo had been passed over. So, the Lord of the Iron Warriors built a fortress of his own, a perfect trap, a false bastion. He lured Dorn to it. And Dorn accepted. The battle that followed was not war. It was annihilation. An industrial massacre. A siege turned inside out. Dorn led the Imperial fists into Perturabo's hellscape and found himself caught in a mechanical crucible designed by his equal and his shadow. Thousands died by the hour. The fists bled for every meter. And Dorn, he would not retreat, because this was not strategy. It was penance. Only Guilliman's intervention saved them. A full-scale relief fleet forced Perturabo's hand, and the Iron Warriors withdrew into the warp. But the cost was unbearable. A third of the Imperial fists dead. Entire companies erased. Dorn returned to Terra, shattered, and then vanished. They say he broke his weapons across his knee, that he screamed into the void, that he placed his own name upon the casualty rolls and walked into the dark. I believe all of it. The unbreakable wall was gone, and in his place, only the fortress remained. Statues lie. They speak only of triumph. They forget the silence of the ones who never returned. After the Iron Cage, Rogal Dorn was no longer seen. Not truly. He reappeared only as necessity demanded, signing documents, approving defenses, standing at the edge of the void like a sentinel carved from grief. He was not a man. Not anymore. He had become a monument, to loss, to failure, to duty unfulfilled. Where once he built fortresses of stone, now he built them in silence. And when Guilliman, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, issued the Codex Astartes, his vision for a new, fragmented structure of the Space Marines, Dorn resisted. Not out of pride, out of pain. The Codex demanded that every legion break into smaller chapters. Never again would one man wield the strength of an entire legion. The heresy had shown the cost of such concentrated power. Dorn disagreed, not because he sought empire, but because he remembered. He remembered brothers turned against brothers. He remembered terror in flames. He remembered the emperor, broken upon the golden throne, and he believed, still, that walls only stand when whole. But even Dorn could not defy history forever. After a brutal standoff with Guilliman and his reformists, after threats and near civil war, Dorn relented, not because he was convinced, but because he obeyed, as he always had, as he always would. And so the imperial fists were broken into chapters. The Crimson Fists, the Black Templars, the Executioners, others still unnamed. All bore his blood, all carried his scars. But not Dorn. Dorn had one final war left to fight. When an immense chaos fleet surged from the Eye of Terror, a black swarm of vengeance led by the cruelest of traitor princes, Dorn stood first to answer. The Imperial fists launched in force to intercept them in deep space, long before they could threaten any loyal world. And Dorn led the charge. He told none. He gave no last words. He simply boarded his ship and vanished into the void. What followed has been lost to time. A battle in the deep dark, shrouded in warp storms and static. No signals, no survivors, no certainty. Only wreckage, only rumors, among them a shattered gauntlet. Carried home by a chapter serf, weeping blood and whispering Dorn's name in a language no longer spoken. Some believe it is all that remains of the Praetorian of terror. Others believe he still lives, that in the darkest corners of the galaxy, where fortresses still stand unbreached, he watches, waiting, enduring, guarding. The truth? No one knows. But this much is certain. Rogal Dorn never surrendered. Not to despair, not to pride, not to the creeping rot of doubt that claimed his brothers. He was the wall. He still is. There is a place in the Imperial Palace where no one goes. A sealed corridor, behind layers of stone, steel, and silence. At its end is a single black door, and above it, carved into gold, "He did not yield." They say behind that door, he still waits.